in the Return of Prodigal Son, Amri Naon is um, traveling to St. Petersburg to Hermitage, and he sits there in front of the painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt. And what he does is his little book is basically interpreting Rembrandt's interpretation of the parable. The kind of things that he picks up are just absolutely amazing. For example, he'll say, the father has different hands. Mm-hmm. One is feminine and one is masculine. There's so many other things that he's doing. And I remember saying, wow, why would he go there? Whether he means grace and law or male and female, who knows what he means. But it's this, when you have the freedom of actually seeing what God would want to show you and engage you on that level, there is a certain freedom that comes in that you can actually, the parable could go so much deeper. What do you say to that?
The parable opens, as you point out, to multiple interpretations. So if you want to point out the masculine and feminine, to me that says, let's call the parable of the absent mother, and try to figure out where that mom is, which then leads me to wonder, maybe these children, the prodigal and the elder brother, the prodigal and the prudent, maybe they're children of different mothers, because this really echoes the Joseph story.
Which is which would fit perfectly.
Absolutely. So even just one reading, one interpretation from one word opens up then a host of other texts, other images, particularly from the scriptures of Israel, because that would be this template. For me, it's perfectly okay and probably helpful in a number of cases to read the dad in the parable as God and to read the younger brother as the repentant sinner. That's terrific. I've been teaching for years in a maximum security prison here in Nashville, and that reading is really important to the guys in prison, because a number of them self-identify with the younger brother, and they need to know that whatever they did, God still loves them. That's terrific. I just don't think it's what the parable originally sounded like to a group of Jews.
So we're a group of Jews, and thousands of people that are listening and watching this right now. What would they hear in this parable?
Well, the first thing is they would not hear the parable taken out of its own context. It's the third of a triptych. And Luke gets them right. The first parable is sometimes called the lost sheep. I want to call it the parable of the frantic sheep owner who lost a sheep. The second is the parable of the lost coin, which I want to call the parable of the frantic housewife. And then we have a parable that begins, there was a father who had two sons. None of this has anything to do with repenting and forgiving. It's Luke who tells us that. And that doesn't mean that Luke is wrong. It just means Luke has given me another interpretation of the parable. So after the
Luke is the Amri Naon of the Rembrandt, sure.
Right. And that's appropriate. Luke is a pastor as well as an evangelist. And Luke is going to say, look, I've got these three parables. Here's what I think they mean. But I don't think first century Jews are hearing that. So again, it doesn't make Luke wrong. It just takes it one more iteration. In the first parable, there's nothing about a good shepherd. The word shepherd is never used. It's just a guy with 100 sheep who loses one, which means I've got a relatively rich guy who's down one sheep out of 100. And as soon as he knows he's missing one, and he lost the sheep, which means he can't be God because God doesn't lose us. This guy lost the sheep. How does he know he's lost a sheep? And this is where I think the parables function. The only way you know that you've lost one sheep out of 100 is because you have to count them. You can't say to the sheep, here, line up in groups of 10. Sheep won't do that. So you pass them through a sheepfold and you count and you realize you're a sheep short. In the second parable, we have a woman who I don't think is God. I don't think the sheep owner is God. I don't think the woman is God. And I don't think dad in the third parable is God. However, if we make dad in the third parable God, then the woman and the sheep owner have to be God too. That's my plug for a feminism reading. Anyway, All right. So the woman loses a coin, right? How does she know if you have 10 coins? You have to count because you can't simply look at 10 coins, a bunch of coins in a pile. You have to count them. And what does she do? She notices one is lost. There's an all-out search. Then there's a party. by the time I get to my third parable, I'm expecting a certain number, one to be lost, the person who did the losing doing the counting, and then a party. That's how the parable sets up. Jesus is brilliant here. He begins, there was a man who had two sons. Okay, I'm a Jew. I know the plot line because I've seen Cain and Abel and Ishmael and Isaac and Esau and Jacob and Manasseh and Ephraim. It's like, yeah, I'll know this because it's hardwired. So I know that the older brother is going to be fratricidal, hairy, stupid, and inept. And then I would date the younger brother who's going to inherit the covenant. However, this is a parable, and parables never go the way you think they're going to go. So what happens? I get the whole story about the younger brother, the prodigal, which is why we call this thing the prodigal son, which is an incorrect title, should be the man who had two sons. And then I get the prodigal coming home, and dad does exactly what the other parable characters do. He throws a party. The line in the parable that should grab us and doesn't, because we're so focused on repenting and forgiving and all that stuff. And I'm not sure younger brother repented. I think he just went through the motions. Nor am I sure actually that he sinned. I think he was stupid, but being stupid is not necessarily sinful.
It's not sinning, yeah.
It just said he engaged in dissolute living, but some of that might not be halakhically inappropriate. It's just stupid. The older brother was out in the field and he hears the sound of music and dancing, and he calls a slave to ask what's going on. And the slave said, oh, your brother came back safe and sound, and dad's put up a dinner. They had enough time to call the band and the caterer, and nobody called the older brother because there was a man who had two sons and he did not count. And now what do? Because it's relatively easy to pick up a lost sheep, and it's very easy to pick up a lost coin. It is very, very hard to pick up a child who was lost, and that's the older brother. That's where the morality of the parable comes in. And that's where we enter. And then we start thinking about all those older brothers we've rejected, like Esau or Ishmael. They're part of the family too. Instead of thinking about repenting and forgiving, we think about maybe you should go to the common table and give that the repenting and forgiving an opportunity to happen rather than waiting before you eat together. Or maybe it's about counting and how do we make sure that everybody feels counted, particularly when you have one child who sucks up all the air in the room, and then another child who does exactly what you want that child to do. Or for me as a teacher, I know that the really smart students, because you do, and I know the weaker students because I make them come to my office so I can tutor them. But what about the student who's always getting like 88 or 89? How do I make sure that she feels counted? So I think it's all about counting. And then after I wrote the book, I tried this out in prison. And I said, it's all about counting. And one of my guys at Riverbend Maximum Security Institute, where I teach, said, AJ, we're counted 6 times a day. And that hadn't occurred to me. So I think, how do you make sure that when you count people, you're counting them to recognize them as individuals and as important and as part of the larger whole, rather than counting them as simply numbers to check off on the list. So here, one more iteration from my guys in prison that hadn't occurred to me.
Shalom, I'm here to invite you to come with us on a journey of discovery into the Jewish context and culture that will forever change the way you read and interpret the Bible. As you slowly go through our self-paced, on-demand program in Jewish studies relevant for Christians, you will gain ability to discover the original meaning of the biblical texts. You will see the nuance hidden behind our best and faithful translations, and to interpret these ancient texts in their original meaning. At Israel Bible Center, we provide you with the state-of-the-art, simple-to-use technology. This way, you can study on your own from the comfort of your own home, even towards your certificate in the Jewish context and culture. This study will strengthen your ministry as you continue to serve God. We will guide you through our large collection of crash courses by our fascinating faculty and roundtable talks with leading world scholars. Our weekly Israel Bible magazine as well as Israel Bible podcast that focuses on the land of Israel, will assist us along the way. We believe that the Bible does not need to be rewritten, but it needs to be carefully reread.
Click the link and register today to our wide variety of biblical courses.